Mhm. Good morning and welcome to the program.
Good morning.
I appreciate very much accepting my invitation in spite of not knowing very well each other. We just met once.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, because we don't know yet each other very well, we'll take a few moments to map up the territory.
Okay.
So, may I ask you, what is the thing or the things you are most passionate about?
I would say about my faith, about helping others, family, community, things like that are very important.
You have been most of your life involved in home health.
Yes.
That's providing health services at the home of the patients.
Yes, for seniors. Yes,
Seniors.
I've worked in the home health area as far as providing workers for seniors. Also worked some in a period where we worked with what's called MHDDAD, which is mental health and developmental disabilities. We had a period of maybe 6-7 years where we had some people staying in our home who had some disabilities while we were working with the home health area as well.
Yeah. Your interest in providing health services has some roots. It's something you got from your family, or it's part of your mindset, interest, how it...
Well, actually, when we moved to Georgia, I actually moved here to go to school for physical therapy,
I see.
but ended up going into a different direction of actually opening a home health business as
Yeah,
opposed
yeah.
to working as a physical therapist.
Yes, yes. So that was not something you observed or in your family, or no? It was
Not necessarily, no. Just picked up the interest somewhere along the way.
Yeah, we'll speak more about that. So, because we mentioned family, tell us a few things about your family of origin.
Well, I'm actually from Texas.
I see.
I have parents that were from Texas, have 4 brothers and 1 sister from Texas. In fact, they all live in Texas. I'm the only one who lives here. And both of my parents are deceased.
Yeah.
My father in 2003, my mother in 2015. So my family, as I said, is mostly in Texas.
Yes. And what are some of your memories of early childhood? Did you have a happy childhood?
You asked a good question, because the question actually will open some of the things. I had a very happy childhood because I loved family, and our family was very close.
Yeah.
But I did have some memories that weren't that good, because unfortunately my father was an alcoholic.
Oh.
And that probably affected and influenced my life, second only to the influence of the love of my mother. That's the strongest influence in my life, is my mother and her relationship with God, and that affected me more than anything else. But right behind that, if not possibly more, was growing up in a home where my father was an alcoholic.
Could you give a little detail on?
Oh, sure. For example, growing up as a kid, I lived in a neighborhood that was very close, and everybody knew everybody.
Yes.
And in fact, my home was the school, the middle school, and the elementary school was like, my home was here, and the schools were on this side. So the first home in the community was my home on the corner. So when we used to come home through the neighborhood, I used to be very hesitant to come home,
Really?
because I didn't want my friends to ask, can I stop at your house?
Oh, I see.
Because I didn't know whether or not my father would be drinking that day. So that used to affect me a lot. And
Lots
then,
of shame and...
oh, absolutely, without a doubt. I had experiences, unfortunately, where one time, this is probably one of my most dramatic memories, is my backyard, we had a basketball court, and I used to play basketball, and all my friends did. And there was one time when all of my friends were in the backyard playing basketball, and my father was drinking, unfortunately. And he came outside, my mother was sitting and watching us, and he ended up, bothering my mother because he was a little intoxicated. And my mother ended up hitting him with something over his head in front of my friends. So it would seem funny, but it wasn't funny to me and it wasn't funny to my friends. So those kind of things were just pretty much the norm from as early as I can remember. I remember being 5, 6 years old, hearing the contention between my parents. And then when I became about 16 years old, I played sports all my life, but I started going to the gym lifting weights. One of the reasons was to get stronger. But possibly the primary reason to get stronger is since my brothers and sisters went out with their friends, I could stay home as much as possible to take care of my mother. And so that's what I used to do. I would go out sometimes, but a lot of the time, I would just sit home and tell my father that you're not going to bother mom because I'm big enough to deal with it. So that kind of colored pretty much my entire life and even some of the things I deal with now. But, it's manageable now.
So I hope I don't go too deep.
Oh,
Your
no,
father
it's fine.
was
It's fine.
also violent from time to time? Not extremely violent.
Not
but,
extremely. That's the best way to say it. He wasn't extremely violent, but he was, very verbally abusive. But the amazing thing is, in the midst of all of it, that's why my mother was the strongest influence, because no matter what my father did, this probably influenced me more than anything else in my life, that no matter what he did, she never encouraged us to mistreat him. She always encouraged us and always constantly said to us, that's your father. You'll never disrespect him, no matter what he ever does. And she said that from my earliest years until I left home at 17. That was always her focus.
That's very impressive.
Never disrespect your father.
I was going to ask you, in such a difficult environment and so much shame and trouble and situations you can't improve because it's not under your control. How did she manage? Because it's so easy in such situation to become bitter and antagonistic and hostile and cynical. How did she manage?
Well, her faith. And I can tell you probably the most central focus to her faith was, Mom read the Bible regularly, but this is what all of the kids in my family knew, and there were 5 of us, as I said. If you ever made the mistake of coming down the hall to where her bedroom was, and she had started praying, you could go do your homework, go do any and everything else you wanted, because we all knew that Mom's prayer time was very extensive. In fact, I could say very, very extensive, because if she ever started praying and we came down the hall, we would be like, oh, I didn't get there in time, because it would be a long period of time. So I grew to understand that the thing that kept her with everything that was going on was all of that time we saw her on her knees. And then later on, when I became an adult, my mother started talking to me about her prayer life. And she told me, she said, every last one of you, as far as prayer is concerned, she said, I prayed for each of you the entire time you were in my stomach, every last one of you. And she said, that's the key to everything that keeps me strong spiritually. And that's what my mother's biggest focus was. She never really taught us a lot about the Bible. She taught us principles. She read herself, I saw her, but she never really did a lot of teaching you principles. But her primary thing was us knowing that you would always find Mom for an extensive period of time every night on her knees. And that was her key to keeping everything together.
Very impressive. Having a mother with such a strong prayer life was an attraction to you, was something you wanted to emulate, or was in a way a little intimidating to you, feeling like I'm never going to be like
Well, growing up, I'm not sure I really thought about it a lot. I just knew that my mother was extremely kind to us and to my father. And I also knew that everyone my mother met was like a friend. It didn't matter who, whatever race, whatever young, old, in between, everybody really loved her and she loved everybody. Like, for example, back in 2015 at her funeral, there was all different ethnic groups there. And I was not surprised because of how she related to everyone. And that's how she always, everybody was welcome. Whenever we were at the grocery store or anywhere, she always greeted everybody. So it just, I don't know if I really thought about it as much as I really saw the byproduct of it, how she treated everybody and how everybody loved her. And I just thought, you know, and I think when I was younger, I never really understood that's what it was. I understood it better in later years when I started praying myself. But back then, I just looked at it as, we just knew that that's what Mom was doing. We also knew she was very kind. We also knew we loved her a lot. Because I remember telling someone just the other day that I remember when my mother used to pull in the driveway and you could hear the shocks on the car come in the driveway. Many times I would go out the door and I would go meet her at the car door, take her purse, put it on my arm, walk with her to the door, get out on my knees in front of her, like in a chair like this or at the couch, and she would wear these knee-high stockings. And I would get out on my knees and take them off of her and take her shoes off. And somebody said, "You did that your childhood? When did you stop doing it?" I said, "When I left home." It never became, it was an absolute privilege to be on my knees in front of my mother every day based on how she treated us and how she treated everybody else.
That's so beautiful, yeah. She died in 2015, you said. So it seems that she came to live quite a long life, I think.
She died when she was 85.
85, yeah. So in spite of such a toxic situation at home, she managed both to be kind and loving and faithful to God, but also to be in relatively good health, I think.
Yes, she really wasn't sickly.
Really?
Until it was October of 2014 when she got sick. I actually was in San Antonio for something, and she had gotten out of the hospital because she had a blood clot in her leg. And my sister said it kind of came all of a sudden, and so they took her to the hospital. She was there for about a week or so. And I came home, which was a Friday night, the 14th. Well, actually, I came to San Antonio then, and I came home that Saturday. And we ended up taking her back to the hospital that day, and she was sick from October of 2014, and she died May 26th of 2015. But other than that in her life, she never really had any major illnesses or
that's also very impressive, because usually, you know, such difficulties and emotional stress, and also, you know, it takes a toll on the physical health as well. But she seems to be dealing with that very, very well. It's very impressive.
Right.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you one other thing that impressed me about her. My mother and father separated after 27 years. And they only lived a few blocks from each other. Well, my father got sick in his later years. My mother moved back in with my father and took care of him after he got sick, even though they weren't married anymore. And that's just how she was. And that's what she taught us.
A little earlier, you mentioned also race. Do you have memories? You grew up in a time when there's still a struggle. Well, in a way, it's still now, but it was much more difficult in those years. Do you have memories about, you know, racial tensions and?
You know, not where I grew up in Killeen, Texas.
Yeah.
There wasn't a lot.
No.
I don't know why. I sometimes wonder if it was possibly because we grew up at the military base. And so I'm not sure if, because there were so many different races in the Army, that maybe the kids at the high school were intermingled because of the military, that it maybe cut down on it something. I knew it was existing. Now, my father, unfortunately, you know, kind of had some issues with it, or he would tell us that he had issues with it. But my mother never really said a lot about it, even though I knew it existed. I, you know, lived in the world because I knew. But personally, I never really had a lot of major issues with it.
I understand. And so your father was in the military?
He was in the military for a short period of time.
For a short period of time,
Back
but you
around
remained,
the time of war, about 3
but you
years.
remained there. You continued to live there.
Well, what happened was Dad was in the military when he lived in another area in Texas when he was younger.
I see.
And so he worked for the civil service. Both my parents worked for the government for about 40 years. We actually were born in Temple, Texas, which is about 20 miles from Killeen, Texas. And the reason we ended up living at the base, or right at a small town called Killeen, next to the base is because my parents, with having 5 children, if something ever happened to any of us, they didn't want to have to drive 20 miles to get to us. They said the best thing for us to do is move right next to the base so that if something happens to one of our kids, we can be there quicker.
Yes.
And that's why we ended up moving. We moved there December 6, 1969.
Oh, you have so clear memories of everything.
Yes,
That's it.
2 days before I turned 8 years old. we
I
moved
see.
there.
And what were your interests while you were a child in school? Did you have some favorite classes?
I probably had 2 favorites. I did pretty well in school, but
Yeah.
especially in elementary school, I had interest in spelling. It wasn't that I actually chose it. The teacher chose me because she said I did well in spelling.
I see.
We did a national test, like Iowa test they take,
Yes.
and I was like in the top percentages.
Mhm.
And so they started asking me to participate in spelling bees.
Mhm.
And I did very well. And I also was very good in math. Well, interestingly enough, I found out after my father died. Now I knew when my father was living, he was very good in math. But I didn't find out until long after he passed, and this was like within the last couple of years, that my sister told me some stories about my father that he never told us. My father didn't really tell you a lot of stuff, but I found out that my father was so good in math that when he was in school, he actually quit school. My father only went to either the 8th or the 10th. My father or my mother, it's one or the other, 8th or 10th, one or the other,
Yes.
I don't remember which. But when my father quit school to help work, and help take care of his family because his parents were sick. My family, I found out through my family that the teacher came to the house and said, don't let him quit school because he's so good in math that he excels in it and he could really, really do major things. Well, he ended up quitting anyway because of having to take care of the family for a black family in those days. But I also found out another story that I didn't know either. And my parents bought a car one time. And my father was so good at math that the gentleman worked up the cost of the car on the calculator. And my sister said my mom told her that the gentleman came out and gave the price to my parents. And when the person slid the paper over, my father looked at it and said, that's incorrect. The gentleman said, no, I just did it on the calculator. And Daddy said, no, I'm telling you it's wrong. And he said, okay, because you're the customer, me and the manager or someone will go back and look it over again. And they did. And found out Daddy was right. He was so good at math that he could pretty much look at numbers and he could pretty much just figure out things just like that. And one other strength he had that I know I inherited from him because my mother told me in my own experience is my father didn't forget anything.
Oh.
I'm telling you, almost nothing. And he really had a little problem with you if you forgot things. He would always say to us, I don't forget anything. Now then I didn't really appreciate it.
Sure.
But now, and as I grew up as a kid, and even when my mother used to say to me, when I would share things with her that I remembered, my mother would always say, you're just like your father, because your father never forgot anything. I'll tell you a funny story quickly. When I was in high school, I had a really good friend. And we used to walk around the city because we didn't have cars. And if he met a friend that was a female, he would turn to me and say, remember this number because I know you won't forget it. Because he would always tell it to me. And I can remember friends' phone numbers from the 7th grade. I remember our phone numbers from the 60s. I remember even like if I read a book or I can see in my mind the page, where it is on the page. I mean, I don't have a photographic memory. But it's somewhere in that neighborhood because I remember, and it was straight from my father.
Fantastic. It makes me only think, if it were not for the alcoholism, what beautiful life,
Absolutely.
outstanding life your
Absolutely.
father could have been living. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Because he was very gifted.
He had a brilliant
bright,
mind, far more than anything I ever understood. I'll tell you another story you might enjoy. My sister told me this just a couple of years ago as well, because she had left, I had left when I was 17, and this kind of really touched my heart. My sister had went home, her and her daughter, to live with my father for a short period. Well, he was up in the middle of the night, and she was asking him, well, what's going on? And it was only the 3 of them staying at the house at the time. And my sister conveyed to me that my father revealed to her why he drank.
Oh.
I never knew this. When he was in the military one time, overseas, he was in the foxhole. Everybody in the foxhole went to sleep, several of them in there. When he woke up the next morning, everybody was dead in the foxhole but him. And so he told my sister that nobody really understood in the family, that he always, his entire life, wondered, why did God keep him alive? And he dealt with this trauma of seeing all of these men dead. Well, I never knew that while I was living there. I found it out 40 years later. So you never know what pain is causing someone. And I almost felt this sense of, wow, Daddy, you dealt with all that pain, but you never told us.
Yeah.
You never told us.
His problem with alcohol shaped in a way your attitude to alcohol?
Absolutely.
In what way? Because you know, quite often, children, especially sons of alcoholic parents, take the habit as well. Yeah.
It hit me, it affected me like this. When I grew up as a kid, and we used to go out different places, like with kids to little house get-togethers or parties, you call them. The moment I tasted something, and it tasted like it had any alcohol in it, I pushed it away. When I was a kid, very young, and I used to do that as a teenager, I thought it was because I was being a good kid. But the more I matured, it became very clear to me why I pushed it away. Not because I was the greatest kid, but because I had the fear of being like that, being like my father and what I saw, because there were other relatives that did the same thing.
Really?
So I realized it was a fear, and I was trying to protect myself from being in this position of not being in control. So I then, everywhere I went, I wanted nothing to do with it. Now, sure, there are principles I live by, but as far as having it in my house or someone bringing it to my home, I had a cousin once in Texas tell me, he said, I'm going to come visit you in Alabama. I think we were in Alabama at the time. And I said, sure, you can come. And he drinks. And he said, now, you know I'm going to bring my alcohol. And I told him very politely, I said, you can bring it to the state. You just can't bring it in my house. And he's like, oh, Shelbert, oh, Shelbert. I said, oh, I love you. I said, but you can't bring it to my house. So it fully shaped me. I really don't want anything to do with it. Sometimes people try to discuss, say, on moral grounds, whether you should or should not drink. And I tell them, I don't really have to discuss it from a moral point of view, how detrimental alcohol is. I don't need to open any books. I just look at my life and see you can't try to help persuade me that that's any good for anybody, large quantity, small quantity. The only quantity for me that's effective is no quantity. That came from my experience.
There is no better moderation than abstinence.
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. So that, to me, that's the only way.
What was your relative position among your siblings?
Of the alcohol?
No.
Where did I fit? Oh, I got you now. Okay.
Yeah.
Oldest brother next to the youngest brother. I mean, there was oldest brother, then the next brother, then my sister, then me, then the baby.
Oh,
so I'm next to the baby.
Next to the baby. What was the space between children?
The baby is like 6 years younger than me. My sister is 1 year older than me. Then there's a brother that's like, he was born in 58, so he's about 3 years older than her. And then the oldest brother is like 2 years older than him. So it's relatively close. The biggest gap is between myself and the baby. He was kind of a surprise.
Yeah. What was the religious affiliation of the family?
I mean, what church we grew up in?
Yes.
We grew up in the Church of Christ.
This is kind of, would you describe it a little?
I didn't, as a kid, I didn't really know a whole lot about it.
Yes.
I just knew my mother was very faithful to it. I knew she made sure whether she was working or whatever she was doing, she always took us to church.
Yes.
It was a very friendly environment. It was a big part of our lives. Other than that, I really couldn't explain a whole lot about it, but that's what we grew up in. Our religious affiliation was the Church of Christ.
Your father was also attending?
No.
Not at all?
My father never, in my entire life, my father only went to church went to church for funerals.
Yeah.
That was it. He didn't attend church. My mother was serious about church.
You think he was not believing in God? Or,
Oh, he believed in
he
God.
believed in
He believed God. He
God,
prayed
but
over his food, and
yeah,
oh yes,
I
yes,
see.
he spoke about God sometimes.
I see.
Yeah.
Do you know if he ever kicked off the habit of drinking?
At the end of his life, I'm not really sure because I lived away, and I would go home from time to time. I don't know near the end if he actually
I see.
stopped. I don't know. I hope so. You know, my sister used to talk some about him accepting and becoming a man of faith as far as personally,
Really? Mhm.
but I don't know. I just know one time I went home, and this was years ago, I had left a spiritual book at home,
Mhm.
and I remember coming home, and the book was in his bedroom, and it was open, and you could tell the pages
Yeah,
were bent,
yeah.
and someone had been reading it.
Yeah.
And so he was the only one living there at the time. So I went to him and asked him who had been reading the book, and he said I had.
Mhm.
I was completely floored because he never had any, read like my mother read or
I
anything
see,
like that.
I see.
So, but I believe then that there's hope for anybody, and we can't call what the end will be for anybody. So I don't know what his, situation was finally.
Were your relationship warmer and good toward the end of his life?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I love Daddy. We had the issues growing up,
Yes.
but I knew without question that I loved him. When I used to go home, and we would go visit my wife and I and kids or whoever, we always went and hugged him and kissed him like nothing ever happened.
Sure.
And a lot of that was the influence of my own faith, but also how my mother taught us all
Yes,
along.
yes.
So she taught us always love your dad, always respect him no matter what he does.
That's very, very impressive.
So we always respected him and loved him. And so when I went home, it was like,
Because it's so easy for children to observe the tensions and the mutual disrespect or whatever, and to take one side. Usually, yeah.
I had some of those feelings, but they never fostered into a large situation. Now, when you look at all of our kids in the family, of all 5 of us, now 4 of us are fine, but one it affected more than any other, even to this day.
Really. So that speaks a lot about the lingering effects.
Oh, it affects you, for
Yeah.
sure.
How did you become an Adventist?
That's interesting. One of my favorite stories. I used to play football in Texas, and it's interesting that a lot of my upbringing helped for me to become an Adventist. What do I mean? I used to play football in high school, and there was this young man who came down to visit from Jersey City, New Jersey. He actually was in trouble in New Jersey. He came down to stay with his kind of play brother, kind of a brother of the family, who was a captain in the military, who had discipline and all of this. So the family there sent him here or to Killeen, Texas, to help him be more disciplined and get him off the streets of Jersey City. Well, he was at the high school telling a lot of stories, kind of straight off the street. Well, it came a time where he followed several of us home, and it was 3 of us. And when we came into our neighborhood, I could see the guys looking at each other funny because they were like, the way this guy is, I'm not taking him home. Well, my parents, especially my mother, was very hospitable to everyone. So when we came to this corner and we were going to make the decision on whose house he was going to go to, since he was relatively new, but he talked a lot, had a lot of street lingo, I knew he was coming with me because I knew that's what my family would want. So I took him home with me. We became close friends. When we became close friends, when his brother came to visit from one of our universities, Oakwood College, that accepting him closer as a friend made me have exposure to his brother. And then when I met his brother, who came down for a couple of weeks one summer, I just watched him, and I asked him a few questions, and then he began to share things with me from the Word of God. And then I told him, well, if I ever, as a teenager, really became really serious about faith, now I went because my mother took us, but I said, if I ever become really serious about faith, I'm going to visit an Adventist church. And so what happened was, a year later, I ended up moving from Killeen, Texas, to finish my senior year in high school in Fort Worth, Texas. And in Fort Worth, Texas, there was a young lady who happened to be the niece of the youth director for Southwest Region. And what happened was she called the house one day for my cousin, and I had just moved there. And he didn't answer the phone, and he wasn't even there, in fact. And I answered the phone. And so I told her who I was, introduced myself on the phone, and then she said, well, what are some of the things you want to do while you're here? I said, well, one is I met this gentleman last summer, and I heard about the Adventist church, and so I want to visit an Adventist church. She said, well, I'm an Adventist. And that was my first encounter with her. Like I said, she was calling for my cousin. And so the very next weekend, I went and visited the church. I remember sitting near the back, and when he did the appeal, he said, maybe this is your first time visiting, and you would just like to walk down and shake my hand and say you'd like to learn more. So I got out of my seat like I had been planning that for my whole life. I walked down, shook his hand, and I've been here ever since. And that's how it happened, on a football field, meeting a friend through football and the hospitality that my mother taught me.
Do you have any idea what triggered that strong reaction? And
probably, you mean just for me to come down automatically?
Yeah.
Well, the reason I think that affected me the most is when the gentleman a couple of years earlier, I watched him and asked him questions. He took me to the Bible and showed me that what he was talking about was in the Bible.
Yes.
Well, I went home and asked my mother a couple of questions, and she said, honey, if it's in the Bible, then you should follow it. So that stuck in my head. So a year later, then when I went to visit, I knew that it was the thing I should do because it was in the scriptures. And then when he said, if you want to learn more, that's exactly where I was. I wanted to learn more. So I went down and shook his hand, and the rest is history.
Do you think the fact that you were already so strict on alcohol and learning that these people don't touch alcohol on scriptural basis, do you think that also played a role, or
No,
not very much?
Not at all, because I never really knew an alcohol, non-alcohol thing. I just heard some of the new things that I learned and from watching this gentleman, and so I just wanted to investigate it. So the appeal was so specific to me that caught my eye, because he just said, you want to learn more? And I'm like, yeah, that's what I'm here for. So I went down and shook his hand, and I never left.
What was the reaction of your family?
No problems at all. No problems. My mother has always been supportive of everything. You know, she remained in the Church of Christ, but to the day she died, she would call me, or I would call her on the weekends, and she would say, happy Sabbath to me.
Yeah.
So no problems. My mother has always supported us in everything.
Yeah. So later in life, as you said, you became involved in providing home health services. Was that something which fulfilled your need to share love, to communicate, or it was just a way of making a living?
Well, I think it partially did. And I think, again, my mother, the biggest influence in my life.
Yes.
One thing my mother always did, and it influenced me a lot to where she noticed it.
Yes.
My mother was very big on making sure that seniors were taken care of. Like when we went back to visit family or went back to Temple from Killeen, Texas, maybe 20 miles away, she would always make her rounds. If there were any seniors that she knew of, or any family, whether they were seniors that were related or seniors that she just knew because she grew up in the area, she would always make her rounds and visit them when I was a very young child. Well, the interesting thing was when I got a little older and I was a teenager, when we went to the city, I would ask her to make the rounds myself. Could I go see this? And she started saying, wow, that's interesting that you want to go. And so she knew that. And she began to learn us as children. And she knew, and she said to me, after I got married, she said to me, I knew you would be the first child to get married. She said, because of your sensitivity. She said, I knew you would be the first child. So when we got married, she said, I knew you would be the first. I never knew she thought that. But she said, I just knew how you were, because everybody loved my mother. I can't say I loved her more than anybody else, but in a lot of ways, she said to me, you're the most like me. It's kind of like clinging to her, and you get a lot of her characteristics. She was very sensitive to people, helping people. And so I think that's what influenced me more than the senior thing. I'm not really sure how I mean, the home health kind of came from being in the health arena and kind of leaning in that direction.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's a very, very interesting to have these windows in the way your mother shaped you and influenced you. And I also have very, very vivid memories of my mother doing the same things, taking care of elderly people, especially when they are alone, families, left to them, and they're struggling and sick and all kinds of things. And later in life, I also came to have a great affection for elderly people.
Oh,
And,
wow. That's interesting to know.
yeah, and even now, this is the reason I'm here. For the parents of my wife, they both are advanced in age and no family here with them. Both of them had stroke.
And you said both of the parents are here? They live here?
The parents of my wife. My
Your parents of your
in-law.
wife
Yeah,
are
my
here.
parents passed away, yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah.
And actually, it's interesting. We have something in common there. My wife's parents in 2012 moved from Indiana here to live with us.
I see.
And my father-in-law still lives with us. He'll be 98 years old on the 21st, and he's still with us.
Yeah. Do you have one or two stories of your interaction with elderly people, which are very dear to you?
Most of the stories I have would probably be more so with my family.
Yes.
But not that I can think of that really ring a bell with me.
It's all right. You are now in a transitional time, if I heard you correctly. You, little by little, you separate yourself from this kind of work as a profession, of course, not as a attitude or because you feel like having a new calling.
Right.
Speak us more about that.
Well, years ago, and it was actually 2002, we actually did church planting. We actually planted a church. And for me, I have never found anything that satisfied me more.
In my language, very, very few people
know
would
what church planting
understand
means.
church planting.
It means starting a new church.
A new church, that's a new denomination, a new... Or
just a new church within your organization.
Yes.
You actually turn in an application so that it has governance and direction and organization, which is so important. And I believe in all of that. I don't believe in independent anything. I believe that we need each other to help do anything, whether that's resources, whether it's encouragement, whether it's guidance, whether it's direction. So we actually did it within our church organization.
I like that because many people feel that you have either one or the other one. You can't have both. If you work within the confines of an organization, then all creativity, all boldness, everything is gone. If you on the other side, then you have to be on your own, and nobody will going to help you if you are in trouble and things like that. I like the way you see both of them working in cooperation, but also taking personal initiatives and taking risks, because not every such enterprise is going to succeed. So tell us more.
And what happened is, a little bit before that is what got us actually into this experience. We started visiting a particular church around the end of the 1990s. And at that church, my wonderful wife made a suggestion to someone that she thought I was a good teacher, and that I should, because at the time I was just sitting in church, I wasn't really participating. And my wife went to one of the leadership and said, you ought to have my husband to help, because just generally speaking, he has certain gifts that she knew I had, but I wasn't really utilizing, or talents that I was just letting go to waste. And so the leadership came to me and asked me, would I be willing to help teach at church? So I did. I began helping with the teaching. Well, once I started teaching and they saw those gifts, they asked me, would I be willing to start speaking at church? Well, I was like very hesitant, because one of the things that came from my past was, because of that whole situation, this real shyness, this real not really having a lot of self-confidence. But I knew at that time I had just kind of recommitted myself to God in a special, special way. In fact, so much so that at the church we were attending at the time, that morning, that very morning, I always loved doing early morning prayer service. So I led out and I was talking about Jeremiah that morning, and that whatever God would have us to do, we should be willing to do it like Jeremiah. And I was really talking about it strongly that morning. Well, after church that same day, the gentleman came to me and said, would you, on the same day, would you be willing to speak? And I was like, who, me? And he was like,
apply what you have told me.
That's it. Apply what you have said. So I said, let me think about it. And so I thought about it and I prayed about it and I even consulted with people. Do you think I should do it? And I got different kinds of advice. One person told me, go up front and try it, and if you fail miserably, you'll know it's not for you. I'm like, yeah, that's for a person that really doesn't have a lot of confidence to do. So long story short, I ended up saying, okay, at my church, I would be willing to do it. But it's so interesting how God works, because as soon as I said okay in my mind, I had not yet said okay at the church I was at. I hadn't said anything to them yet. But the strange thing was, I said, okay, Lord, I'll do it. But I didn't go back and tell the person yet. And we were at home on a Saturday night. I was laying on the carpet and my phone rang, and it was 1:45 to 11:45 at night. Phone rang. We were just laying around talking as a family, watching TV or something. And I answered the phone, and this friend told me, he said, what are you doing next week? And I said, teaching like usual, or helping if I have to teach on the schedule. He said, the reason I'm calling you, he said, I came home and I was listening to this old song, and the song was saying, we need to hear a word from you, by this musician called Andre Crouch. And he said, I was praying, who is supposed to speak at our church next week? And he said, and your face came before me. And I was like, what? I was already dealing with the trauma of my own church. And then when I said yes, this person called me from a totally different church and asked me would I be willing to speak. And I said, I was making 1,000 excuses. I said, I got to teach Sabbath, I got to teach school, teach at class and all the rest. And he says, it doesn't matter what time, because whenever you finish, then you can just come over. So I ended up doing it. But I told him, I said, you're going to have to help me with the introduction. So he did. I just wrote a little introduction and I just shared. And I was so blessed by what God did. People thought I was doing this a long, long time. And several of friends came or whatever. Well, long story short, the people went back and told the person at the church that, hey, he spoke and it was a blessing or whatever. And so then he ended up asking me, well, I got to go ahead and give you a date since you're okay. So I ended up speaking. God started really blessing more and more. And so people started coming to me saying, you should start your own church. And I said, no, I already had enough problem just speaking locally. And so different friends started telling me more and more. But what finally happened was, I was reading on a Sunday night, and I just felt these strong impressions that now I'm telling you. And that's how I ended up starting a church in 2002. And interestingly enough, that's how it started in 2002. And from 2002 to 2012, it became a full church. And so when my wife's parents came around 2012 and I was doing business and other things, we just felt it was a time to take a sabbatical. And so we did in 2012. And so for a period I've been working, but unfortunately my mother-in-law passed in 2014. And now I still, speak and share, and I just feel this strong, strong pull to go back, because I already do it anyway, to focus in and zero my efforts on ministry as opposed to home health and ministry. So I'm seeking to work on developing that right now.
So in this sense, you are in a transition now.
Right, in the transition on exactly what God would have me to do.
How was the mission of that project chosen? What was your target? Your idea was to bring people from other existing churches to new location, or to reach out to know people who are not members of the Adventist Church and work with them, Bible studies. What was?
Well, I'll tell you, and you asked a great question, because one of the number one objectives was to invite nobody from any other churches. I never invited one person, because I never wanted anyone from any church to feel like he's
You're
taking our
competing,
members.
yeah.
Yes, so I never did it, never invited one single person. And as a result, people used to come to me and say, I can't believe you never invited me. I mean, but I was like, and I told them why. It was no insult. I just wanted it to be that if God brought you here, he brought you here. And the objective, of course, was to go to the community.
Sure.
So that's what we focused on, to focus on
And
community
how did
ministry.
you work? How did you begin?
Well, we began doing some of the normal things, but I learned over time, and I'll say, you asked me specifically, how did we begin? We would like go visit door to door,
Yes.
talk to people, do surveys, try to find out what ministries work in the community, learn about the community, that kind of thing. That's pretty much what we did, learn about the community and then try to set up a relevant ministry that we could consistently do. Because one thing I learned when I was in ministry, you can do seasonal ministry or you can do relevant ministry. And to me, they're worlds apart.
Very interesting.
Seasonal ministry is kind of like, we want our church to grow, so we're going to come to the community for 4 weeks, 2 weeks. And then once we finish with this evangelism program, we will go back to what we're doing. I don't believe that. I believe the more you understand that God has made a commitment that is eternal and the relationship is a continuous thing, then you must set up ministries that are relational and continuous, which means whenever friends ask me now, and they still do, as they deal with churches or starting new churches, the first things, 2 things I always tell them. The first one is you must give yourself an entire surrender to God. That's always the most important to me. Then secondly, you must ask God to guide you to what relevant ministry you can do in that community. And I always stress, not seasonal, but relevant, so that it can be done year round. You don't build relationships with people occasionally. And God doesn't want us, just like if you're attempting to marry someone and you want to go from dating or further. Now, if you want to just date, that's one thing. But if you're looking to build substantive relationships, you must make it a continuous, consistent thing. So I always tell people, go to the community, under God's guidance, of course, and find out what you can do year round. Because you have to turn around and say, let me sit in the seat of the person in the community. Trust is one of the most important things that undergirds building relationships and developing a community church or whatever you want to build. Trust is not built upon inconsistency. So if you understand trust, there's a wonderful book that I would recommend called The Trust Edge. And the gentleman that wrote the book was talking about whether it's in business, churches, or anywhere else, it's always based on trust. Even when you look at things like the stock market or whatever, it's always they invest according to the trust factor. In churches, business, whatever, if you have someone that recommends you to someone to do business, it's based on the fact that they already trust them, so you recommend and you say, well, hey, I can trust them if I don't meet them myself because of your trust. So when you go to a community, you will never build trust by inconsistently dealing with anyone. So I always stress relevant ministry. Deal with the ministry that you care, deal with the ministry that you can deal with long term, so that you not only just go in and scratch the surface and leave. Anything that has substance takes time to prepare the roots so that you can dig deep and it can grow strong. If you go in and do it quickly, you'll never develop roots. And then long term, it'll affect. If you do have people who join your community, your faith community, they won't necessarily stay that long because you never set it up in a way that affords long-term trust and roots, so there will be substance. And then you'll see it come back and affect you later. That's how we
it's
set
like
it
a
up.
natural process, and you can't cheat nature.
Absolutely. Even
In
when
farming, you can't compress time.
Right.
You have to
go
start
through the
in
entire
time.
process, and then you have to stay with the process. Sometimes when I share in a new group, I pass out paper all over, which I may go online and get, and I'll call it beginning gardening. And we will talk about gardening and then compare the two. You have to weed, you have to water, you have to mark your territory. If you want the weeds to stay away, you have to be consistent in the garden, and you understand.
Yeah, sure. And many people have the opinion that faith is something personal. So it's not something you want to speak about or to share with others, especially when you have a different faith or you go to a different denomination. What would you say about that?
Whether or not you should share your
Yes,
faith,
yes,
what
yes.
you believe as
Yes,
opposed to
yes,
what they
yes,
believe.
yes.
Well, I personally believe that the backdrop or the foundation for
Yes.
sharing your faith with
Yes.
anyone is, first of all, how you treat people. Because I believe that there's a whole lot of information going on about faith, but at its most basic level, if you look at the example, Christ, he treated people well whether he agreed with them or not. So before we talk about our faith, I want to see the fruit that it bears in your life and how you treat people. Because one of the things that faith speaks of often is, how do you treat the least of these? But not just the least of these, because in business, I've encountered people that are middle class. I've encountered people who've sold businesses 30 years ago for $400 million. So you have to treat everybody as God would have them to be treated. And I have found, this is just my experience, if you treat people as God would have you to treat them, when you agree, and even when you disagree, people will many times ask you, what is the source of that you have? Because a lot of times, now let me say sometimes, because I don't know the numbers, sometimes we talk faith, but it doesn't produce kindness or tolerance of an opinion that's different than our own. So if we treat people, and I'm saying only the foundational first, is I just believe if you treat people kindly, you will have opportunities to talk about differences. People may ask you about what you believe or what your faith is, or it may put you in situations where people will ask you about your faith. And I can share with you a very, very recent story. Not this past weekend, the weekend before, my wife and I were leaving home. We were heading out of our neighborhood, and there were cars all around one of our neighbors' homes. There were several cars from a funeral home, so we knew someone had passed. So I turned to my wife and said, I think what we should do is, my wife has spoken to the neighbor before. I don't know her. My wife has spoken to her. I said, what we should do is get a sympathy card and go to the door and just tell them we're not being nosy. We don't know who passed. We just want you to know we're praying for you and that we care. And that's what we did. And so as a result, the lady shared it was her mother who passed. I told her my mother passed recently, so at least I understood somewhat what she was feeling. As a result, she told us, I want you all to come back to our home later and meet the rest of the family, which we did. So as a result, we met the family, the minister, and all of the people. And then what she began to tell us is, just because we were just being friendly, she said, well, we're Baptist. I didn't ask that. That's what she said. She said, we do in the afternoon, so I guess it's after church, on the first and third Sundays, she said, we do a fellowship kind of study thing in our home, and we want you all to come. So that affords us an opportunity to meet people and to talk further. And eventually, I'm imagining they will say, well, where do you go to church? Things like that. We have one other neighbor that was in the hospital some months ago, last year, and he sent me a message and said, will you look out for my house, because he lives in the same cul-de-sac. He said, they're checking me for pneumonia in the hospital, and he's only been in our neighborhood like 2 years. So I asked him, would it be okay to come to the hospital to visit, and we'll definitely look out for your house? He said, sure. We went to the hospital and had just missed him. So we came straight to his house, called him, he said it's okay. We went to his house to visit him, and we sat down and talked. I told my wife, we'll only be in here maybe 15, 20 minutes. I don't want to wear it out. He's sick, whatever. And he said, no, don't leave. He kept talking, him and his wife. So we listened maybe 45 minutes, 35 to 45 minutes. Well, on the way out of the door, he came to us and came to me and asked personally, what church do you go to? And I think it's because if we will focus on treating people as we should, then we can talk about more things. I could talk to my mother because of our relationship about our faith and, or someone that you're closer to. But sometimes we can't talk about faith because we don't get close enough to people with care to open an opportunity, because care just opens the door
Absolutely.
for them maybe asking you, because I've had more people ask me about my faith than I've actually shared it, because I believe that the opening door for everything is how we treat people, and that's what my mother always taught me.
That's very true. Thank you. One last question.
Sure.
You have now a project or a ministry called
Actually, I'm developing a ministry called Wasted Talents.
Wasted.
And
So you want to waste more talent? Or
no, I see what you're saying. What it has developed from is because I think a lot of the time that I've dealt with a lot of these feelings of lack of self-confidence, I haven't went on and pursued what I believe I was given talents to do. So, and then when I talk to people, I also find that I find very few people who are doing what they believe they were put here to do. And it's interesting, when we had our church, a lot of what was set up in that environment was directly related to that. Now, I didn't fully understand that at the time. I mean, I understood it more, let's say before I got there, let's say it that way. But once I got there, more and more it developed. Because what we did was we set up, based on what God had given us, an environment to challenge everybody in the congregation, I mean everybody, not most, to always be in a program of growing, never being stagnant, so that whatever talents God has given you, you can utilize them to the fullest. And that's what we utilize. We had a program called Surrender, Challenge, Grow, and Go. A lot of times in ministry, we know the gospel of all faiths is generally take it to the world, go ye therefore. But something that God gave me, and that was an idea, is people need to not just go. What is it that happens before they go? There must be a program in place. The first for Christian is always surrender. So if you surrender and you give God your all, where he says, follow me, then he will challenge you beyond where you're comfortable. And if you go, or use your word, risk, beyond where you're comfortable, while you're challenged, you will go. And as you are challenged, you will grow, and that will prepare you to go. And so our program was Surrender, Challenge, Grow, and Go.
thank you very much for sharing so insightful incidents and situations from your life, and especially speaking to us about your future projects. The best is yet to come.
Well,
Thank you very much.
And thank you very much for having me.
Yes.
I really
Thank you.
appreciate it. Thank you.